Hello, good afternoon, welcome everybody. Nice to see some of you for the first time and others from yesterday. This is our second day on this Orality event, Borders and Transcendence. My name is Elena González and I'm the director of the Center for Mexican Studies of the National Autonomous University of Mexico in the United Kingdom. And as we have said, this is the third year that we have, not consecutive, that we have an Orality seminar, and we are very, very pleased to be collaborating with Mariana, Masera and with Susana González on this. And today we have two very special guests, Professors Alison, Sinclair and Ruth Finnegan. And we shall hear all about a new translation of Ruth Finnegan's book, Oral Poetry, that was done by UNAM, and we have one of the translators here with us. We're very pleased to have you here as well, Jorge, and other very, very welcome guests. This is the kind of thing that we, from the Center for Mexican Studies, we do to promote academic exchange and collaboration with British universities and institutions. And we are always looking forward to new possibilities of exchange. So thank you very much, very welcome. And now over to Mariana.
Hello, good afternoon, buenas tardes. Estamos todos aquí con esta, es un honor tener en este tercer encuentro, this third Orality, to have the Professor Ruth Finnegan and the Professor Alison Sinclair. We would like to hear about this book, about the significance, and we are going to listen to Alison and to Ruth Finnegan, and afterwards the editors, Berenice Granados, Claudia Carranza, Susana González, and myself, we are going to comment something, and I think we would like to listen now, Alison and Ruth Finnegan. Bienvenidos, welcome to this third Orality.
Oh, just thanking you also from my part and regarding this collaboration between La CIPI, the group Mariana is directing, and Poética Sonora. It is a great pleasure to have this launchment of the book. It is like a preliminary launchment because the book is about to be ready. We thought that it was going to be ready for today, but it's going to be printed very soon, so we'll let you know. Don't worry. But anyhow, you will we will have an approach toward the book itself, the process. Alison is also going to discuss this with Ruth, and we're going to show you at least the cover. Maybe we have the possibility of showing the cover. And with no further ado, let's go over to the talk. Yes.
Oh, behind you is your book.
Thank you. Oh, very good.
Just as a bit of background, as far as I'm concerned, my being here sort of happened because of COVID. Because I think the first Orality seminar I joined online, and that was the occasion on which I met various people, and then we corresponded, and some people agreed to write for a book I was editing, and then was it only last year in Berlin I met some of you in person, and it was amazing. But I also have in the audience Barry, who I've met for how many years? I forget now. Many years, because that was a different sort of contact. And it's not that either is better or worse, they're complementary and they're a pleasure, because we do have contact with the people, whether it's online, in person. Barry and Jeff, I've got a question for you. Can you help? Which was the way that we used to go. And now I've got the chance to talk with Ruth Finnegan. I'm going to give you a small introduction to Ruth, but the best part is going to be just prompting Ruth to tell you about herself and her work and her interests, and we will take it from there and we will play it as it goes. So, Ruth Finnegan, OBE, renowned scholar. You're an emeritus professor, as am I. You're at the Open University. You're a fellow of the British Academy, honorary fellow of Somerville, Oxford. And recently you were elected as one of the first 4 international fellows of the American Folklore Society, a much valued honor. Now, that prompts me to recall that one of the first things that I read but returned to frequently was something that my first professor wrote as the result of a talk to the American Folklore Society. This is Edward Wilson, and in it he talked about Pliegos Sueltos. These are chapbooks, and he said there's all this other marvelous literature. And now, ladies and gentlemen, he said, we are going to go slumming because we were going to look at this street literature. So I'm interested to find the American Folklore Society here. You grew up in Donegal, and that's where you spent the war years. You went to the Mount in Yorkshire, a Quaker school. So you know all about the weather up there. You had to learn to read aloud, but also you told me you had to learn the text that you delivered, wasn't it?
Before we could have breakfast. It really went in and everything.
Now, what I particularly enjoyed when I was reading about Ruth's work and her life, a more amazingly productive person it will be difficult to find. We've got flyers here for the 3rd edition of her book, Communicating. You've written all sorts of things, plays, whatever. And when in 2017, you were listed on the list of 50 great writers you should be reading. And I'm not very good at responding positively to, you've got to read this, but it endorsed you as, I quote, an all-round author, and yes, dreamer of dreams, an author of full-length fiction, non-fiction, poetry, short stories, and picture books, as well as a screenplay and libretto writer. You are nothing if not versatile. Now, I want to ask you about things in sort of 3 rough sections, if that's all right. First of all, about what you wrote about in your 1977 book. And then I want to ask you to talk about the Spanish edition and how it came about and what it was like dealing with the translation. I've got other questions about you and oral poetry. And we have somebody called Claudia who has sent in a question, and we have other questions from the floor. I'm sorry to be, if that's disrespectful. So your 1977 book, it is clearly the result of extensive work. I read it in English, first of all, because that was the edition I was able to get access to. And it reads in the way that you speak. It's clear. It's full of common sense.
A lot of sociologists said it therefore cannot be deep because people will understand it.
I thought it was just right. Perhaps you could tell us a bit about how you came to write that book, how you came to that subject, and was it originally broader than the 1977 one? And tell us a bit about your academic background before writing it. That's a lot of questions, but you can do it.
Well, I'll leave the second question about how I interact with the Spanish edition.
Yes. Yeah.
Later.
Do you want to use your ice cream?
Well, I want to be Bomba in Bletchley Park, where they broke the Enigma code. They had something called Bombay or Bombine, which everybody thought meant ice cream, but actually it meant the code. Well, I suppose that oral poetry book began when I was when I was hearing people speaking Ulster, Irish, what in England they call dialect around me, what in fact is the language, because what they talk in English is in England, in this faraway place called England, is dialect. And it was, by the way, thank you for your introduction saying that I was I was a jack of all trades and a master of none.
I didn't quite say
Well,
that.
I mean, no. Ulster, or let me call it dialect, is actually very witty and very aware of the sound and kind of clipped and very much the kind of performance which you think isn't a performance. And so I became aware from a very young age, without being aware, that language was a beautiful thing. And do you mind hearing this again, Alison?
Okay.
My father was very gentle and quiet, with a very quiet Ulster wit. You didn't laugh at yourself. But he did have one party piece, which I always thought he'd made up, but actually I find is in the folklore. It went like this. I sat next the Duchess at tea. It was as I thought it would be. Her rumblings abdominal were something phenomenal, and everyone thought it was me. And that's another thing I learned for oral poetry or oral performance. You need to have an audience laughing. Well, then I went to Quaker school, and as Alison said, I learned a lot about speaking aloud, because we didn't just learn them off, we had to speak it aloud all together. And the awful thing was on a Sunday when it was all right if it's a narrative story from the New Testament or a poem, because sometimes in English literature. But when it was a bit of, Paul or someone philosophizing, it was really hard to link together all those consecutive verses. And we had to repeat the whole thing on the Sunday morning when we had a bit special breakfast. And I was the head girl for a term, and the head girl had to kind of lead, and everyone followed. So if you faltered for an instant, everyone would stop. And I have bad dreams about that for long. But this is all that bit is irrelevant. But the speaking aloud and together when you had to say the same thing, you couldn't extemporize with composition and performance a la Lord. So I knew from very early age, without thinking about it, that if it was jointly, it had to be identical, or more or less identical enough words. And that's what happened in Fiji with their dream poems, songs, dance songs. Well, I went to Oxford and I studied classics. And I can think of no more wonderful privilege than reading Homer and Aeschylus and Catullus, and in those beautiful surroundings, how people could talk about work and how women were so discriminated against in the 1950s, way back then. And when in fact we were the top dogs, there were one of us to 7 men. We ran all the societies. We got the best results. I got the 3rd best result in classics in my year, which is the biggest school at that time, just by working hard and loving it. Then I decided to go away and teach for a couple of years, because in my leftish wing kind of way, I thought I should serve in the real community, not be like these privileged Londoner students, self-indulgent, who were going to stay do this thing called research, which I thought I wasn't capable of doing. Anyway, what's research? Though I had written some quite good research essays, I realized later. And then I thought, no, I would like to go back and learn a bit more, because I don't know nearly enough. And of course, I could have spent my whole life studying the classics. Wonderful. But I did think, again, in my leftish wing way, that sure, and my liberal way, that sure, and my parents' way as well, that surely there were other cultures in the world that deserved to be studied with the same care and discipline and dignity as the ancient world. And I thought, I'd study Africa. I don't know why Africa, there's something kind of Jungian about Africa. And I was told the way to do that was anthropology. And they were very good at Oxford. And I went back to Oxford because I had connections there and I could get funding there and so on. And I slipped easily into a graduate diploma and then further dissertations at Oxford. I didn't altogether like the idea of anthropology then, because they thought the world was divided into two parts. And I'd met that already in Ulster, Catholic and Protestant, which is why I was sent to a Quaker school to try to understand that. And I did mostly, because if you'd studied classics, you knew there was at least 1/3 place, not just the primitive against the civilized. So I wasn't altogether happy. And I was really quite shocked to discover that in their very, very well-resourced anthropology library, they did not have a single book by Marx. And it's not that I worship Marx, but surely he was part of the intellectual tradition. And I did give them a couple of copies of collected stuff, which I think they did read, some of them. Well, I then went on. I am coming to the point, honestly. I then went on. Method of madness, not too many senior moments yet, we hope. I then went on to do fieldwork in a small village, quite remote, you couldn't get to it by car, in northern Sierra Leone. I think if I realized what I was doing, I would have been a bit taken aback, and my parents certainly were, but it was just taken for granted that if you were a clever student, you would go on. And the professor was very sensible. Because it was a graduate diploma, he wanted everyone to make use of their earlier degree. And so I was, well, it could have been philosophy, it could have been history, but I was encouraged to look at the literature. Well, I managed to get a scholarship to go, because it's quite expensive doing fieldwork. You have to buy a car, have assistants. You mustn't pay people for telling you things, but you should give them gifts, a kind of gift exchange, and pay them something for staying in their village. After all, you're using their resources. I well remember my interview. I was told by my main teacher, Godfrey Leonhardt, that do choose a people whose name you can pronounce with. So I chose the Limba. That's easy. That's Limba. And I went to the. I was their brightest student in those 2 years. That's honestly true. They told me so anyway. I was interviewed by this body that later became the Social Science Research Council, and they asked me various questions. They were very sympathetic and nice. And then the chairman said, "And Miss Finnegan," because that's how you're called that, "and Miss Finnegan, what theoretical framework are you going to be using?" Theoretical framework? I had no idea what that was. We didn't talk about those things then. So lovely Lucy Mayer, who was quite a feminist and a very good applied anthropologist, said, "Well, I suppose Miss Finnegan will use the structural functional framework, won't you?" So I said, "Yes." And actually it's true. That's what everybody said that the Oxford anthropologist used. And I suppose I did use it functionally. She wanted to see how, say, polygamy, which looked so wrong to us, actually had functions in helping with the chief to get the resources to entertain visitors, which he had to do, and so on, so on, so on, so on. Well, the grant they gave me was to explain why the Limba, so strangely, these city dwellers thought, wanted to go down to the town and not stay in their beautiful rural, hard to live in, but beautiful, cultured backwaters. So I did write a bit about that. It was published, but really I found I wanted to study storytelling, because I discovered that though I began from a classics framework, that you would get a text, then you would write notes, and you write a commentary, and you would write a translation. That's what I thought I was doing. But fortunately, I was lucky enough to be told by a cousin who had used it in a dialect survey in Scotland that you can get portable tape recorders. I was, I think, about the first British anthropologist to do that in fieldwork. And I recorded them, but I also watched and experienced them telling it. And I realized that it wasn't the text. It was I can't really wave this around. It was the performance, not just the kinesics, visual, and the prosemics, the distancing, but the audience there, the singing, the scent of the palm wine, the atmosphere, the whole reaction. And often they told it by the light of the moon or with a paraffin lamp, so you could see a certain amount, mainly told by men at that time, but that's all right. So I published that book, Limber Stories and Storytelling. And then I went to take a job in Ibadan in Nigeria after having gone away from southern Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, because it had turning into apartheid. Nigeria, not so beautiful, but democratic. And I decided, no, one step back. When I was writing my doctoral thesis, writing up about my limber storytelling and performance, 3 volumes, it was so heavy to carry 3 copies of 3 volumes by my bicycle up the steps, but I managed to knock that passed all right, just in time to get married to my husband. When I'd been working on that doctorate, you know, in our doctorate, you're always supposed to have a chapter on literature, background literature. Literature was a chapter. And I find that so difficult because everyone said nobody knew anything about the background of storytelling and oral literature in Africa. So how could I do it? But then I discovered that actually there are a whole lot of scattered things, German periodicals and Belgian periodicals and so on. But I didn't get very far with that, but I just felt there must be some background. All right, all the people in, well, a lot of the people, most people in Britain would say there's no literature in Africa because they got no writing, which even that wasn't true, actually, with Arabic writing from centuries before, but that didn't kind of count as writing for some reason. Anyway, I at last found a book called African Prose. At last. And I was so pleased, but then I discovered that it was actually just a 2-volume set of extracts of written prose, which is all right, but not what I wanted. But then I decided I am going to write the book that people will need for their literature research in future. I never thought before I would do it. And now this is really important for the background to oral poetry. I will write it, I will call it oral literature in Africa, not of Africa, because it's different all over the place, oral literature in Africa. And it will attain the same dignity as classical literature has. And I will show that it can be studied in as great depth. Well, nobody can really equal Homer, but otherwise in as great depth and with as many controversies, this is really important, and debates and issues as for any literature, even Spanish literature perhaps, in the world. And so that's what led me on to writing oral literature in Africa. And that directly lies behind my whole approach to oral poetry. I've almost finished and answered your question, but I'll just say, what was the proximate cause of oral poetry? It was, oral literature in Africa was very much welcomed by enlightened people. And I had the backing of the professor of anthropology in Oxford, who was the chairman of the delegates of the Oxford University Press, and well associated with the Times Literary Supplement. Well, that was Oxford University Press. A few years later, when I was at the Open University, I remember this very charming, very bright young girl called Sue Ellen Mills coming into me. And she said, well, of course, we mustn't try and cross swords with Oxford, but I'm from Cambridge. What do you think of doing a shorter version? Because that oral literature in Africa was a very long book. I don't actually see how it could have written it shorter, and I don't know how you could. Well, maybe you could do a summary in 20 pages, but you couldn't really do a shorter version. So I said, no, I can't. And anyway, by now, I realized I want to bring in Homer and Sanskrit epics and the Bible and modern poetry. So no, it's impossible, it's too big. And then I thought a bit more, and I don't know if it was that same afternoon or if it was later. I thought, well, maybe if I bring it down to poetry, it will still be very, very big, but I'll try it. And so I got OPS, OPS, oral poetry. It was originally called Oral Poetry and Society. Gosh, way back, because that's what everybody put in "and society" to show that they were taking a detached as well as humanistic. I can see a laugh back there from the British Library. Showed that they were, very detached and academic. But I'm glad to say we've now got rid of the "and society." It's just oral poetry. So that's what it is.
Wow. Okay, thank you. Gosh, so
I put down my ice cream.
I realized as you were speaking that I think we have some things in common. And one of the things I've just noticed is that what we had in common in what you've just said is that you set out to write the book that you thought people who needed to work on the topic would need as a resource. So I did something that took me 10 years, and it was a terrible project.
Huge, yeah.
Yeah, it was huge because it was the book that I had needed and didn't have.
Oh, interesting.
So there we go.
All of you will do the same.
Yeah. But well, that's very interesting and very practical, I think. And I think that one of the things that comes out in what you've just said is how you had curiosity, but you also saw how things were and how the wind was blowing, and you had a sense of realism about the world that you were working in. Now, there was the 2017 edition of the book. I wondered if you had any special thoughts about that edition. That's coming back to it after some time.
This new one,
the 2017 one. And I think the translation was done from the 2017.
Well, the 2017 one, well, first of all, there was one in 1992,
right,
in which I answered some of the criticisms, because it was very, very criticized by some people to say, you put a Beatles lyric in the same category as whom? Actually, I can't help. I put in Eleanor Rigby. I'm not sure if I was allowed to use the words, but I did, and nobody's actually objected. But I will never forget, because everyone was singing the Beatles songs.
Yeah.
But it was quite hard to capture the words off. I wanted to put the words in because it's all poetry. And so I went to the British Library, which was then the British Museum, and I ordered it. Everyone was reading it. And you maybe know, I was taken into a special room, a special desk, because it was a special place called CUP, C-U-P. Some people pretend that means covered, but I don't believe it. And I had opened this book with Eleanor Rigby and all these other songs that would be sung everywhere. And there was a man at the, maybe it was you, at the door watching me in case I got up to something not specified. But I was very criticized for that. And I was also very criticized that a great scholar that became a close friend called John Miles Foley, some of you may have come across, he's written very good stuff about oral poetry, came out the same year as one of my books. But he absolutely adored Albert Lord. And Albert Lord, as you remember, introduced the oral formulaic composition and performance view, which was absolutely brilliant. And I learned much from it. The only trouble about it was universalizing. Every form of oral poetry was like that. But I could see that, for example, the Fijians, they learnt it off by heart. And there's some other kinds of unwritten poetry, which is word for word. Albert Lord was very charming to me about it, but his graduate students, this one, John Miles Foley, lovely man, absolutely tore into me, both at the time, but the first international conference I ever went to, I gave a talk, what is oral literature anyway, with Albert Lord there. And he attacked me for saying the opposite of what I was saying. Because, I put up one view and I said, I don't agree with this because of the, but he obviously didn't read beyond the one view. And then he attacked me because there was something in the South Slavic, there was a proper name, I've forgotten just what it was, Chilich or something. in South Serbian, one of the poets, the epic poets. And in the original, it has a little over the sea. But Cambridge University Press didn't have that, or my typist didn't have it. And oh, he tore into me about that. Clearly, I was an absolute useless scholar. But later on, he was lovely. I mean, he never apologized. But when I went and stayed, and his wife cooked lovely breakfast, he said, sometimes our loyalty leads us too far, which is a thing worth remembering, actually. It's good to be loyal. But, or as my mother would say, be good, but not too good. So the 1992 edition by Indiana University Press had quite a long introduction, kind of defending myself, but it's not needed now, because I think now everybody would take it for granted that it's okay to bring all these things and say there are differences. Of course there are even differences between, I think actually the Iliad and the Odyssey are by different people, but that's another story. Now, what was
Well, I wondered if we could just sort of come in here, because one of the things that's coming out of what you're saying is what it was like to come up against attitudes that seem to me, as you recount them, and I've met them, rather rule-bound, and they lead people to pontificate as though there are only certain ways that you can go about investigation. And I wonder if theory itself has some sort of Marmite effect. It divides us. That you know about Marmite? Yeah.
Yes. You like it or you hate it.
Yeah. And I think the thing that has been controversial about what you've done is you didn't ditch everything. You said, oh, well, there's this idea here, and we could think about it in this way, and we could think about it in another way. And it's not that you don't say what you want to say, but you say with great clarity what the situation is. And that seems to me to be very helpful. And one that's still of use to us. Now, there's something that I think is in the introduction to the 1977 edition, where you talk about the disciplines of literature and sociology as being, could you enlighten the assembled company? Is this something that comes to mind easily?
Golly, that's a way back in the past. But I think, let me put it this way.
Yes, you don't have to answer my questions at all.
At the time, they were thought to be opposites.
Yeah.
Just like I've just been finishing off, my husband, he's now in care, talk about biography of his father, how history and biography are sometimes seen to be the opposite, but actually in a way they're the same, or they shade into each other on the different sides of the continuum. And looking back on it, Alison, all of you, I think a lot of my work has been to say that things are along a continuum rather than being opposite. And a lot of academics very much like opposition, because that makes, I can understand it, that makes their position clear. And in a way, by showing the opposite, you can show the truth of your own and the truth of the other. But I prefer to look at the continuum. And I think that comes out of my family as well. My father was very much a peacemaker who wanted to understand other people. Or if you don't mind me mentioning my middle daughter, who is the senior partner of one of the leading, first woman, senior partner of one of the leading law firms in London. Now, she is the gentlest, loving, most delicate person, understanding. But she's known as the toughest negotiator in London. And I say, but how, Kathleen? And she said, I think it's because I can see into people's minds and I see what they will be happy to agree to. And I hope that by pursuing my own way in an understanding manner, I can help to do that. And I do think, going back actually to your question, I'm not quite so senior moment yet. I was very, very lucky to do first what was mainly an arts degree, which was first language literature, then philosophy, but for some ancient history history, you could say, is both a social science and an art, and then go on to do anthropology, which most people would say was social sciences with a little bit of humanistic. And I think having both those things, worshipping literature, but also being prepared to dissect the social conditions in which it was happening, was very good. And just one other thing, I found that with all the books that I like best, I've fallen into them by accident because that's where I was. I got into storytelling, I got into performance, which then became a big thing, not because of me, but complementary. In America, the performance approach in folklore, because I couldn't help seeing it. I got into oral literature in Africa because I could see myself sitting frustrated at the desk in Rhodes House in Oxford. They need to not conceal the past, they need to accept it. The recent book I've done on taxi drivers is because I stopped driving and therefore I had to get taxis. Oral poetry, because of that person who came along to say hello to me. And may I go on to answer your later question?
Well, I was going to say we could perhaps move on to talking about the Spanish edition.
That's exactly.
And how it came about. Why was there not a Spanish translation until recently? So,
well, that's not something I can answer. There was a translation, actually, no, not of that book, but of my communicating book into Italian. And there was a translation of the first chapter of oral literature in Africa into Japanese, and of one of my books on music into Japanese. It's so funny, I had to begin at the back. But it's a very good example, the Spanish translation, as far as I was concerned, my part in it, which wasn't very big, of just taking advantage of where you are. Or as I would always say to any PhD student, if you reach a problem and you get stuck, that's where you found something worth dealing with, not when everything is going on nicely with your hypothesis, the same as everybody else's. Well, to me, I don't know about the other end, but to me, it came about through a wonderful Zoom session when I was asked to speak about the voice, or maybe the voice and writing. And I just hadn't thought, I mean, I worked away on all these things, but being asked to give a talk even today makes you really think things out again, and it comes out afresh. There's something to be said for extemporizing and not learning off by heart, which can be very rigid, however beautifully delivered it might be. I realized how complex the voice was and how, in a way, how simple writing was. If you think of writing as making meaningful signs on a surface, we think writing is more complicated. Our particular form of writing, which is only one form of writing, alphabetic, phonographic, phonetic, letter-based, not pictographic, not pictorial, not pictures. We think that that's complicated because children don't learn it formally until they go to school. But remember, they've had 5 years at least of learning from lots of people how to speak. Think of the complexities of what you learn in that time. And then actually you can learn to write fairly quickly. I mean, the finer details later on, you can go on forever, we're all learning. And I've actually just remembered that some people teach themselves to write, just themselves. Whereas speaking, you learn from all these people. Well, this then, may I say, that Zoom session, as well as leading on to, and I'm hoping to get an English version sometime, a chapter or an introduction or whatever it is in the oral poetry book, it led directly into the final chapter of this, the third edition of my communicating book, which is coming out at the end of October. And it's very fantastic. May I, yes, I will say, because after all, we're not broadcasting. It's meant to come out with a big lightning flash at the end of October and maybe a big launch, but that might not be till the new year. I could see that writing, when you think of pictographic writing, which predates by millennia the other kind of writing. Well, maybe not by millennia, it depends when you think of it beginning, maybe the Phoenicians, 7th century BC. When you think of pictographic writing, where the concepts go direct to you, you don't have to look at letter by letter and then translate it in your mind. And in some ways it's easier, especially if you look at some of the early Egyptians, for example, where the picture of a bottle just looks like a bottle, or a bird just looks like a bird. It then got more stylized. It shades into pictures. I think, for example, of that wonderful in the British Museum frieze of a lion hunt. There's a whole story there. You don't need it. In fact, it wouldn't be so good if it was written down. I mean, it's absolutely, there are many, many other examples like that. Think of mojis. I mean, mojis now count as our kind of writing in a sense, because they're down at the bottom there of our little keyboard. And yet they're surely pictographic. And they're so good because they're cross-language. You get them at airports and so on. People won't understand them. And then I think of pictures communicating. I think of the cave paintings way back at the beginning. Surely, well, the amazing thing is that they are so alike all over the world. How I don't know if it's ESP or what, but it's over several millennia. The dead, huge body in the center, the man with the arrow, the others rejoicing on the edge. Also some signs, but they're not really important, those interesting. They look quite like X's and so on. But they communicated. And if you think of them as a form of writing, in the broad sense, then writing was just as early as speaking. But possibly even earlier in my broad sense. Because here is another thing. Think of sign languages, which are so good because now they are beyond other spoken languages. They communicate directly like pictographs do. They are written on an invisible surface between us or on using a television screen. They are a form of writing. Now, I'm sure that early human beings used a lot of sign language or gesturing, and more so that if you think of the fact that humans descended or closely allied to apes, it's strange to think that suddenly, like, I don't know, Harari Sapiens, humans were human because they had human language, a little bit circular. It was a flash suddenly. Or maybe, I mean, kind of God-given things do happen. The language is a bit kind of God-given. But why should that happen? Why should they not use, well, the gesticulation of apes? Because now that huge amount of research has suddenly come about ape gesticulating. It's really complex. You really can call it a language. In fact, there are now dictionaries of it. Now, if early humans could gesticulate, would that not have been their first form of language? And in my idea of writing as something of meaningful signs on the surface, would that not have been their form of writing and of language? Now, you might say, how can language come from gesticulation? Well, this is all speculation, but really all this stuff about early human communication is pretty speculative. If I'm saying very sorry to poor Alison because she had to introduce me and not say that I was master of none, I would have said, with a little sound, or if I was saying, sorry you had to leave the British Museum, you would understand both. And I think those sounds could well have developed then, especially since human beings are very good copiers, and they would have seen birds and monkeys. Further monkeys have been well studied about, I have a lot about animal communication in this, are well studied as using vocal tracts, which actually apes aren't very well developed for. But they could have copied them very quickly. And after all, they had thousands of years to do it. And so now I think here we are with language. And to go back to your question, this is what ultimately I worked out and began to work out due to you people asking me to give that talk. But as for how the Spanish edition arose, that's in God's hand or on the earth.
I mean, I thought it was partly to do with trying to get towards a bit of equality. How had Spanish as a language for translation been left out of the other languages that your work had been translated into?
It hasn't been translated into many others.
Oh, okay. Well, I assumed it had.
Well, if they have, they didn't tell me.
Yeah. But I've always been,
But the ideas have certainly been.
yeah, I've always been struck by the way in which so-called surveys, comparative literature, tend to leave out Spain, Latin America, just like that.
Second language of the world.
Well, yeah. But I wondered if between you and the translators, we could learn a bit about how did this Spanish translation happen? Because I think this was an unusual way of translation. So can we ask for contributions from the floor? Do you want to come and have a nice green? Yeah.
Do you want
So this is sign language.
or do sign language and the other? I think it's now switched on.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, introduce yourself.
Yes, I'm Jorge Pacheco. Very happy to be here. I'm well, along Ambar, Cassandra, Sebastián, and Hugo. I translated this book. So to answer the question, how did this happen? I think it was in one of the seminars of Orality that same question arose. How come it is not translated to Spanish? So everybody was like, oh, yes, it should be translated. So that was enough to activate the project, and it happened. So not much to say.
Was it a lot of work?
Sorry?
Was it a lot of work?
Surely a lot of work, yeah.
In what way?
I mean, I'll have to expand a bit the notions, not so much, but of course, every book or every translation project implies problems, no? Of many different natures. I mean, moving from one language to another is enough, no? But particularly with this book that has to do with opening the notion of literacy in many ways, that also has to do with opening literacy in translation. So we had like a double agenda, let's say, not only the linguistic, but dealing with a book that has to do with those problems, no? In many senses. So specifically with the Spanish language, we have some problems with problems in the positive sense, of course, no? Some issues with some terms that might be different in Spanish or have a certain complexity in Spanish. For example, the word performance, which is central to your book.
How did you deal with it?
We left it as performance. I mean, it's
very good.
It's a word that it has been introduced to the Spanish language in a very financial way, like the performance of a company or of a team. But also, in this case, we realized we had lots of discussions regarding this term, and we discovered that we thought that in Spanish there's not an encompassing term that has to do with performance as a contextual action in which the performance and the audience are included as a totality or as a continuity, as you were saying. You were talking about not doing opposites, but rather continuity. So we thought that performance precisely sort of includes the continuity of audience and performance. So we chose to keep performance. No, it had other problems, mainly the sound, maybe, which many Spanish speakers, I think they don't like the sound of the word, maybe. But in this case, we decided to keep it. And well, this is just an example, but there were many others.
So it sounds as if it's quite an intellectually creative process that maybe you will write about as well.
Yes, well, Amber Gertz already wrote an article regarding the process. She sort of summarized, well, not summarized, but gave us like a general perspective of the problems which we encountered. So, but yes, of course, lots of things could be coming in the future, because I think the book in itself is very actual, and this opening of the notion of literacy is more important than ever. And in the process of translation, we for sure will keep on thinking of these things.
I wanted to add, sorry? Oh, please. Yes, please.
How did you translate Litras? Whatever you say on
Okay, with the case of literacy, I'm not sure what happened I'm not sure if we came to a specific discussion, because there's this word in Spanish which is literacidad, which pretty much which sounds good and pretty much covers the same notion, but of course this word implies, I think this is one of the concepts that should be, I mean, it implies so many things, no? This concept. And I think we didn't enter so much into the discussion of the term, because we already have literacidad and it works fine. But it could certainly have more discussion.
When I first started reading about
Barry, we're not certain you can be heard.
When I first started reading books about literacy, the main book was Chipola, Literacy and Present Development, Spanish.
Yeah.
About 40 years ago, there was no word for literacy. There was unfettered people all on our
Yes.
So these are,
I think it's too young to.
Make the point that literacy as a word is, it has no history really.
And if you look at it in historical accounts, then there are those who will say, well, it's the capacity of the person to write their name or make their mark in an electoral act, or maybe write their name. It doesn't imply that the person can write or read in any fluent manner. So it's a very changeable and variable and not totally helpful concept.
I'm amazed how deep it goes, in fact shocked how deep it goes in our language, because somebody wrote to me the other day using the word obliterate. And if you think of to stop it being written or to remove it being written, my husband, who is a very good administration, thinks nothing exists unless it's written. And that idea seems to be a little bit in that word obliteration. So I've decided maybe I better not use it.
That's interesting.
Yes, I wanted to add, getting back to the question how it came about that we decided to make this translation. Actually, yes, it was during that first meeting, Orality meeting. It was very spontaneous. And actually, it was just said, into the air. And then we decided, why not? Why not really do this? The thing is also that each one of us, the editors, and I think we're going to discuss that in a little while, came to read your book in English due to other questions or other research fields that we were also interested in. And the fact that we noticed, and today in the morning we were discussing the fact that it was actually a book mainly read, at least in Mexico, by people who were in the anthropological field. But most of us who are interested in it at the moment, or at least during the sessions, we are interested in the literary field.
That does please me.
So maybe the translation itself is going to show also some of these aspects, because each translation has this viewpoints that it highlights, or probably if there would be someone from the anthropological area, they would have translated certain terms in a different way. Huh? So that's, yeah.
So I think that what could be possibly interesting would be a publication which would be the sort of apuntes de los traductores, the notebooks, the discussions that were prompted among the translators, and it would perhaps have a bearing on those who read from a point of view of anthropology, those who read from a point of view of literary studies, and then what sort of literary studies? There are all these different academic cultures, and sort of attaching to that. Can I just sort of raise one thing, which is that in my own limited experience, Hispanic academic culture feels quite different from English and American academic culture. And it's to do with a style of writing and a style of approach. And so, you know, how did they translate it? They're in a different world, and it might have felt quite foreign to you.
No, that's interesting, because there was somebody who did the diploma in anthropology with me, and I liked him very much. And later on, I went back and I met him in Spain, where he was a very senior professor. Very good, very good, very good. But then I was told by some of his younger people, we don't like him, you know, he's too English. So that bears out what you say.
Well, the other thing is that today in the morning we were also asking ourselves, or you were asking, how it is that a translation can be accomplished by so many translators. And there I must say that a huge role was taken over by Ambar Geertz, who talked yesterday about this publication that is also going to come up, where she addresses this collective translation in an article. And I think even though it was really a huge, a huge question how they were going to deal with it, it was solved in a very accurate and very fluent way. Maybe you can just say a bit about the way that you got organized, and afterwards, of course, that we were also the ones who were reading the editors, and also it had to deal with a lot of discussion. Huh? The translation was a discussion problem, a reading problem, and I think that gave also many solutions to the questions that were rising all over the place. No?
I think it's like was in phase,
yes,
the phase of translation and then the phase of discussion.
Yes.
And after you finish your translation, you begin to discuss with us. There were a team discussion about which kind of words you have to use to let performer. It is okay with the literature or with anthropology, which one of these would be useful for us. And that was also a very rich process.
Yes.
After translation, to discuss how we want to translate these words to be useful. But I think something very, very nice that the Jorge said is that we feel that this discussion was so actual, that your words that we were discussing with you, we were listening to you through the book, and we were discussing this new book with it was like a very, very actual. And I think it was very rich, this discussion inside the translator room and outside, inside the very wide team.
So some of us who weren't in that room would like to know some of the secrets of that. I feel that in a number of ways, I'm a bit like a doubting Thomas. I want to be able to put my fingers on the difficulties that you had, and because I think that they are likely to be the really fruitful areas of discussion. That's just.
Can I just put in before you answer? I had to work a lot in teams at the Open University, and they could work one because we criticized each other's work before we went out, which could be very hurtful. And the criticism came in basically two kinds. One sort of maybe fiercely critical, but also constructive, and ones which are personally hostile and horrible. I suffered from those. And what made the crucial difference was the spirit in the team and the sharing, either overt or implicit. And I do congratulate you on that, because it's not a bit easy teamwork.
Yes. Before you answer, there was also the comment on Claudia.
First of all, I'd like to thank Ruth for this book, because it was very important in my education, in my academic education. A lot of years ago, I was introduced in this book. I am a Spanish literature teacher, I'm a Spanish literature professor, but an English professor, Ana Diomon, who introduced me in this book, and it was very important. And I would like to thank also to the translators, because I think that this translation, and the Spanish translation, will be a bridge between literature and anthropology, between social comprehension of literature and
Musicology.
Yes, of course. And it will be a bridge between English conception and Spanish conception of literature. So I just like to thank Ruth first, and then the translation. Thank you.
No.
And also
Thank you for inviting us.
And also generational bridge, no?
I think so, yes.
Yeah.
So there is this question from Claudia.
Yes.
Can I put this?
There's another comment of the editors.
¿Tú vas primera?
No.
Okay, so Claudia's question basically was to ask you about what do you make of more recent developments in oral poetry?
Me?
Yes, you. Yeah, you're the expert person.
Well, I think there's been a lot about, sorry, Spanish speakers, performance. There's also been a lot on say slam and modern pop music. I don't think there's been much on something called oral poetry, because it's now taken for granted that that is just something that is there, and we don't have to account for it anymore the way we felt we had to way back. And though you might say we academics need to have nice subjects like that, I do think in terms of popular culture, that's really a very good thing. But now what's happening, and the same thing was when I sort of started off a bit on the ethnography of music rather than just looking at the old time composers. People are studying specific genres in the light of the more general comparative knowledge. So it's more kind of background, I would say now, than specific. But I could be wrong. I could be wrong. Maybe lots of things are coming out in Spain now as a result of your translation.
Here was Claudia there. So I think
Claudia Carranza
I
was
give you
in the back.
the question.
So this question asks about the reactions to it in its time of an approach to it, which was looking at cultural production and culture, which weren't within the canon of literary study.
Thank you for saying that, because I nearly put it in earlier, you know, reception theory and everything. We need to think about the readership when you were talking about the different ways that people read it for translating. Well, there were a lot of reviews. Well, there was that extreme hostile one. There were ones which were a bit critical, and good thing. There was more interest in America, in America and Australia than in Britain. It was just really passed by in Britain. It wasn't really a subject that people were interested in. You'd think, you know, with colonialism and everything, they would have been interested, but they just weren't. The humorists were quite interested because they caught up with Milman Parry and Albert Lord, and therefore my sympathetic critique of Albert Lord, who was a lovely man, was well received, and some people hadn't yet come across him. I know now that seems hard to believe, but after all, he'd only just been going for a few years. And then, of course, people who liked pop songs and Beatles and so on were delighted to see them come in there. And the other group of people, I think I would say, were people who were interested in hymns and church music, and they were very pleased to have that in as well. But there weren't, I said there were a number of reviews, actually there weren't really that many. And I'm not sure that there were any of the second edition. But on the other hand, Indiana Press, which of course Indiana University is very interested in folklore and in music and in literature and language, they were prepared to take it on as a second edition. And that was actually quite something at the time.
Thank you very much. Indeed, thank you very. The four editors were from the Laboratorio Nacional de Materiales Orales, National Laboratory of Oral Materials. That is really a big project in Mexico that is really opening new research. And I think your book, Ruth, was or is really this a main, how do you say, a principal discussion or a main theme that we are discussing at Mexican University, in Mexico, in Morelia, also with Claudia Carranza. We are discussing in San Luis Potosí, that is also a province. And I think it's very, very important, the actuality also, that we are discussing this with the print, the pliegos, and we are with the spoken word. And I think this brings up that it's really, really important, this second edition, I think, that gone beyond the territories and beyond the languages to open new ways and new research. You know, the new research that is beginning with this second edition, I think we are now imagining the future, and we thank you for that.
Another thing I should have said in answer to the previous question was that I think, well, it's always been so bubbling away in a very implicit but not very explicit way, though it comes through with some of the poets like Gerald Manley Hopkins. What is the difference between prose and poetry? There's a very good, and that came up in oral poetry as well. I decided that repetition and rhythm were some of the key things, though I don't know, I think that's sufficient. I think I knew it wasn't even then. There's a very good book, now I've forgotten the name, Keswick, I think, called The Emergence of Prose, talking about how, was the 12th century? I can't just remember now. It's not a well-known book. I'm sure it's in the British Library, The Emergence of Prose. I think the title is, the author is Keswick, saying that to begin with, poetry was assumed to be the way that people would communicate in any formal way, certainly literature or rhetoric. And prose, that was the strange one, the non-youthful one. And that was maybe associated with print or writing becoming more common, where it was easier to run the lines along. Or, well, speaking in a way is always poetry. And then he talks about, is it in one of Moliere's books, in which somebody says he was speaking in prose.
Oh, yes.
You have to learn what prose is. And oddly enough, I found, I was just prosing on about this at last time, that my novel books, I mean, my books that are novels, are in poetry. I mean, I write them in prose. I think they're prose, and then I read them, and I read them aloud, and I change the words and the word divisions and abbreviations and forms, so they're rhythmic, and they're not end assonance, but a lot of assonance and alliteration all through. I learned so much without realizing from James Joyce and Gerald Manley Hopkins, and yes, and Blake, gosh, yes, and Rumi, who I think is as great as Blake, the medieval mystic poet. So I find now that my novels and my poems, and up to a point my screenplays, come in dreams. That is, in the liminal space when you're not awake, you're not asleep, but you're neither, and it's the most magical, most creative time. I don't know why, and that is always poetry.
I think this work represents a pivotal exploration of the significance of the human voice and the pressing need to establish a comprehensive poetic of orality. Your inquiries into the existence of a distinct oral poetics have sparked vital and enriching dialogues with fellow researchers in the field of speech and aesthetic. And I firmly believe that your book, it's inherently, that you says about the oral poetry is inherently multimodal, is compelling. It challenged us to consider poetry not solely as spoken or some words, but as a dynamic performance at where movement, visual elements, sound, and articulated speech converge, often accompanied by the powerful influence of music. And this perspective presents us with a wide-ranging and inclusive understanding of oral poetry in your book, inviting us to explore its depth beyond mere verbal expression. So I think the invitation is that once again allow us to celebrate the magic and music that oral tradition holds within, using new tools, and most important, to foster a dialogue with present and future generations who will be intrigued by these topics, I think.
Yes, and for those people who are following us through the internet, I also want to add that the book that you are hopefully going to have in your hands, or in the electronic version in the near future. The thing is that you can also, it is a translation, but it is also an extension of your book, because there is a possibility of linking in the examples that you have gathered, and this is a great opportunity to make the experience even further, go beyond the mere text itself, having the possibility to hear the examples in one single moment. And also another thing is that you have included other links to other websites that you find interesting. This is something that didn't appear in the other books. No? So I hope that's going to bring new life to this version, and that it's going to take it beyond the borders of only the translation from one language into the other, but also from one experience, the reading experience, to the hearing experience itself. No? So thank you again for that.
And I hope that it will, well, maybe this isn't needed, lead people not only to study oral poetry, but to do it. Like Elizabeth here sings, and that's both language and music, wouldn't you say? I don't know which would you say comes first?
They're concurrent.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Well, I hope, well, people are doing oral poetry anyway, but let's hope that they recognize and value it. Because it's one of our great blessings, among many.
I don't know if there are any questions from other people. Or?
I feel that we might be coming to a moment of wrapping up.
I think we will thank all the team, Hamburgers, Jorge Pacheco, Cassandra Valencia, Sebastián Maldonado Gómez for the translation, to Grecia Monroy, Fernanda Vázquez, Ana Rosa Gómez Mutio, because they were discussing the terms, the glossary, and of course the editors, Berenice Granados, Claudia Carranza, for Susana González. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Mariana.
Thank you, Alison, for this conversation, and of course, thank you, Ruth Finnegan, for giving us this opportunity to have your book in.
And now you will stimulate me to write something else.
Exactly, and thank you, everyone here. Thank you, Gloria. Thank you, everyone here.
I think it's also very important to thank Montserrat Redondo, who offered us this space at the Victoria Library. We're very grateful to her, and to Anton Lima, who have been very, very attentive with us. And we say hello to Montse for whenever you're able to see this. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Sorry, I have to think. The book will be
available.
Yes, at the web www.libros.unam.mx. We will write the address so you can have the book approximate.
So thank you.